Hey, good morning, everybody. Happy Election Eve, and appreciate y'all coming to join us here this morning. So starting with what we're here to talk about, want to recap some of our robust preparations, the work that we've done to be ready for Election Day. Talk about the official end to early voting yesterday, which was a really huge success, quite honestly. I look forward to talking about the good work that our thousands of elections officials did around the state to make early voting, our month of early voting, such a big success. I want to talk about the good work that our bipartisan boards of elections are doing today to make sure that they are ready for tomorrow. And then a little bit about what to expect for Election Day when the polls close. And then, of course, in the weeks following Election Day, when we do the work to not only certify the final official canvass, but of course conduct our post-election audit as well. So let's start with what we call ready for November. And maybe this is just a bit of military wisdom, but we had a saying in the Army that you sweat in training so you don't bleed in battle. That may sound a little bit dramatic, but what it means is that you do the preparation ahead of time before the action starts. And when you do that preparation ahead of time, you're much more likely to be successful when the pressure's on. We sweat in training so that we don't bleed in battle. That's become a mantra for us, not just over the last few weeks, but really over the last year, as we have made sure that we are truly ready for November. It's similar to a military mission. As a group of Green Berets, when we would prepare for a mission, it wasn't just some Hollywood montage where we grab guns and get in trucks to go off and get the bad guys. It was hours at a dry erase board. It really much more boring than the way Hollywood portrays it. It's a lot of thinking through everything that could go wrong and then putting plans in place to mitigate and make sure that things don't go wrong. That's the work that we've done as part of our Ready for November task force. Our meetings all around the state, our Zoom calls with our county boards of elections, thinking of all of those scenarios that could pop up and then making sure that we've got plans in place to mitigate against that. Over the past year, we've focused on preparing our elections officials and supplying them with the resources and training that they need to truly be ready for November. I'm happy to stand before you and say that Ohio, once again, is ready for November. We're going to run an election tomorrow where it is both easy to vote and hard to cheat. Ohioans are going to come to any of over 3,000 polling locations staffed by more than 35,000 of their fellow Ohioans, bipartisan teams, fully trained, sworn election officials ready to conduct this important work. And at 7:30 tomorrow night, we'll tabulate the results. In fact, in this very room where election night operations is run for our team, and Ohio's 88 county boards of elections will tell the world what Ohioans chose as far as these elections. And again, our standard is whether your favorite candidates win or lose, that Ohioans go to bed on election night knowing that it was an honest contest, and yes, knowing those unofficial election night results. I want to talk about our successful early voting period. Hopefully many of you have been using, I hope this is a tool that's useful to you all as professional journalists, our data dashboard. It resides at ohiosos.gov/data. It is a first in the nation, really in-depth look at early voting, and everything from how many ballots are requested to how many ballots are returned, what method people use to return their ballot, whether they mailed it in or took it to the drop box or delivered it in person to their county board of elections, gets into demographic data, including age and party affiliation. Really, it gives you a great window into early voting. And again, what it showed is that when those numbers are updated here in another couple hours, it's going to show that well over 2.5 million people cast their ballot. That's well north of 30% of Ohio's registered voters. It's going to show you that early voting was a big success across our urban counties, our rural counties, and our suburban counties. Really, Ohioans of all stripes took advantage of those two great options, early voting and absentee voting. And Ohioans trust that it is a trustworthy process. Ohioans trust that it's an honest process. And again, that boosts turnout. Ohioans that know that their vote is going to be accurately counted, honestly reported, are more likely to participate. And I think you're seeing that in the levels of early voting that we're seeing throughout our state. We've engaged in a robust legal effort. It's unfortunate that this has to happen, but every year activist groups file lawsuits at the last minute. They want to change election laws at the courthouse instead of the state house. That's not a good idea. It causes unforeseen consequences. It causes confusion for voters and for poll workers. And so when these activist groups have showed up in the last few weeks with their last-minute lawsuits, we have gone in with a robust legal defense. I want to thank our team from the Attorney General's office, the Constitutional Law section there, and our legal team here at the Ohio Secretary of State's office, who went in and really won some common sense lawsuits. One was Mark Elias, the attack dog lawyer on the far left, who sued to allow ballot harvesting. Ohio has always prohibited ballot harvesting. Thankfully, when we went into court, we were able to win that lawsuit, and yes, ballot harvesting is still illegal in Ohio, as it should be. The ACLU sued us just over a week ago to say that we should accept driver's licenses and state IDs that literally say non-citizen on the back. That defies common sense. Ohioans know better. Ohio's law and the will of the people of Ohio is that we should make sure that American elections are only for American citizens. Again, that's common sense. And so for those that are recently naturalized that have an ID that still says non-citizen on it, we've gone to great lengths to make sure first we sent them all a letter to remind them they should update their driver's license. If they haven't updated their driver's license, then we have in place a safeguard where they can bring their naturalization document to prove their citizenship status. And if they forget to do that, then of course they're offered a provisional ballot and they'll have the days after the election to make sure that their voice is heard. But certainly when it comes to checking ID cards, we don't apologize for doing that. It's Ohio's law. It's what Ohioans expect. And by the way, large proportions of Ohioans on both sides of the political aisle are very supportive of that idea. And so we went into court when the ACLU sued us to allow non-citizen ID cards. And again, common sense prevailed. We won that lawsuit. As many of you know, we've made great strides in the accuracy of our voter rolls. We not only take deceased voters off on a monthly basis, but we identify in those rare cases where non-citizens become registered to vote. And candidly, they probably only spend a couple weeks on the rolls before we catch it and remove it. And over 700 times this year, we've identified non-citizens who became registered. We removed them, and in some cases referred them to county prosecutors or to the AG because, to be clear, that's a crime. Ohioans should know that we take this seriously, but there's more that we can do if we have access to the right data from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And that's why I filed a lawsuit against DHS several weeks ago to finally make them share with us the other three databases. They give us access to one right now. It's not a complete way of doing this work. And so along with other states, we have sued DHS to get access to those other three databases. And I believe that we'll win that in the weeks and months to come, and again, be even better and more accurate with maintaining our voter rolls here in Ohio. Let's talk about Election Day. As you all know, the polls open at 6:30 tomorrow morning. They close promptly at 7:30 tomorrow night. These are voting locations selected by your bipartisan county boards of elections. In most cases, those stay very consistent, but in some cases things change. In rare circumstances, because a school building is under construction or because a church no longer wants to host a polling location, in some cases those change. And when that happens, the Board of Elections has notified those voters impacted by a change of polling location many weeks ago by mail. Of course, it's also on our website. We encourage Ohioans to go to voteohio.gov to make sure they've got the right polling location, to make sure they know what kind of ID to bring, and to take a look at their sample ballot so they can do their research and be a truly informed voter when they go in to vote tomorrow. Again, 6:30 a.m. till 7:30 p.m. People will walk out knowing that their voice was heard and with a I voted sticker, just as we would expect. Our office has a robust system in place to address issues that arise on Election Day. This is something where, once again, we're leading the nation, and I'm going to invite any of you to come with me on a tour of the office to see it. We have our Election Day Operations Center. And again, this probably comes from my military background, but I identified early on in this office 5 years ago a need to have a more centralized way of dealing with issues that come up on Election Day. They come in for a variety of different sources, some from the reporting that you all do, some from social media, some from calls from boards of elections. And large and small issues arise on Election Day, but to be clear, Election Day is a no-fail mission. We have from 6:30 a.m. until 7:30 p.m. to make sure that millions of Ohioans have the chance to make their voice heard, and we won't be deterred in that mission. And so we work through this. Anywhere from 200 to 300 different issues pop up: a power outage, a traffic jam, maybe a piece of equipment that's not functioning correctly, or a poll worker that's not following their training. When these things pop up, we can quickly triage those. We can react to them. and we can solve that problem. We can communicate to all of you and to the rest of Ohio about how we solve that problem, and then we can move on to the next problem. That's our Election Day Operations Center. This is, again, something that the rest of the nation is looking to emulate. We've had secretaries of state from other states call and say, hey, we want to learn about Ohio's Election Day Operations Center and how they run that. And so I'm looking forward to giving you guys a glimpse of that when we walk around. Also, wanted to remind you all to check in with us when things come up on Election Day. The work that you all do is crucial. A democracy only functions when there's an informed electorate. That's why your profession is protected by the very First Amendment to the Constitution. And it's crucial that Ohioans have accurate information. And so when something pops up on Election Day, don't hesitate to reach out to our team to get the facts. I would hope that you all would make sure that what you're reporting is accurate. I know that's a great pride that you all take in the work that you do, and to sort of avoid the kind of sensationalism that creates unnecessary fear among voters. And you can do that by simply checking in with us and getting the accurate information. Of course, checking in with your county board of elections to find out whether something is widespread and systemic or whether it's very localized and it's been worked through and the problem's been solved. Again, that's the work that we all do to make sure that our state, 12 million people, 8 million registered voters, are empowered with the information that they need to be truly informed voters on tomorrow's crucial Election Day. Also want to remind people when they go into their polling location, you need to bring your ID, but you should also bring a smile. And the reason I say that is that you're going to be greeted when you walk into your polling location by your neighbors, by your fellow Ohioans, by a bipartisan team of Election Day volunteers that are putting in a very long day to do this important work on behalf of the state that we love. I expect that Ohioans will be civil and patient and kind with their elections officials because they're doing a really important job. They're under some pressure. And we also would ask people to thank those poll workers. They're doing a great patriotic duty. And again, these are bipartisan teams. It seems like in Washington, Republicans and Democrats can't agree that today is Monday. But at any one of over 3,000 polling locations, you will see Republicans and Democrats working well together. Because first and foremost, they're all patriots, and they believe in making sure that every voice can be heard in an honest and legal election. When the polls close, the work is far from over, as you all know. When the polls close tomorrow at 7:30, we will begin the election night reporting, again, that happens in this room. It's important to emphasize that the very first votes that are counted are those early votes and those absentee votes. It's kind of intuitive why, and this is, by the way, something that Ohio does well that other states still struggle with, is that we've pre-processed those absentee ballots as they came in. What does that mean? That means a bipartisan team has cut open the envelope. They've looked at the security envelope to identify the first name, middle name, last name, date of birth, address, last four of the social, state driver's license number, match the signatures. These bipartisan teams go through that process to prove that that voter is in fact the person that they say they are. Then they sever the identity from the ballot. That's when it becomes that secret ballot that we all rely on. They flatten that ballot out. That may sound trivial, but taking the folds out of the ballot so that it goes smoothly through the scanner is important. Our boards of elections do that. And those ballots are ready to count right at 7:30. As you see the results come in, 7:45, 8 o'clock, 8:30 on election night, those are all absentee ballots and early votes. In fact, you'll see on the election night reporting website that it'll say 0% of precincts counted. That's because those are all early votes and absentee votes. As that's happening, our elections officials are closing down and packing up their polling locations. Of course, anybody that was in line will still have that chance to vote. They're joining each other as a bipartisan team, getting in a car together, a Democrat and a Republican sitting in the car together and driving all of their materials down to the Board of Elections. It'll arrive there around 8:30, 8:45, and at that point we'll be counting the Election Day results that are coming in from high school gymnasiums and church recreation halls and voting locations all over Ohio. We will report quickly, but we will never sacrifice speed for accuracy. The team that works in this room that is drawing that data in from 88 boards of elections is validating that it was correctly transmitted, making sure that the numbers match up with what the Board of Elections has in their official legal copy back at the board. And then as soon as our team can do that, that's flashed out on our website, voteohio.gov, as well as on the XML feed that all of you use to make sure that your viewers and listeners are well informed about what's happening with Election Day. It's also important to point out a really crucial number that's on that election night reporting website. I call it the denominator. It's up in the upper left-hand corner, and it says outstanding absentee and provisional ballots. Why does that matter? Well, as you know, on election night, we will report 100% of our election day unofficial vote total. But what's not included in the election night results is those absentee ballots that are still coming in. Maybe they're coming in from overseas military personnel, maybe from Ohioans who had their ballot postmarked by today, but it's still moving through the postal system. That also includes those provisional ballots that are put aside to be resolved after the election day as that safeguard, that backup to make sure that every voter gets the chance to make their voice heard. The reason why that outstanding number matters is that is the total number of votes that could still count in this election. And so let's imagine a scenario where a certain candidate is ahead by 50 or 60,000 votes in the election night report. But let's imagine in that same scenario that there are 300,000 outstanding absentee and provisional ballots. By definition, that race is not over. Numerically speaking, there are still enough votes that could change the result of that election. And so it's important that we report that properly and that Ohioans understand how that works. Imagine the flip of that. A candidate is ahead by 300,000 or 400,000 votes on election night, and there's only 300,000 outstanding absentee ballots. By definition, that race is over. There are not enough votes that could change the outcome of that with the provisional and the absentee ballots that are yet outstanding. It's also important to know that Ohio law allows us to release election results 2 times, and only 2 times. Once on election night, and once 3 weeks after the election when the official certified canvass is done. And so if a race is too close to call on election night, it is going to be a wait before we can release the results. That's not us delaying or waiting arbitrarily. It's us following the law. And again, the law allows us to release results on election night, which we will do out of this room. And the law allows us to release election results when we certify the final official canvass 21 days after the election. And so that's something to be aware of. Something else that happens after Election Day is the post-election audit. There's a lot of false information out there in the world about elections. And so one of the things that Ohioans should know is that every ballot in Ohio is on paper, without exception. Whether you fill in an oval or whether you touch a screen and it prints off the paper, every ballot in Ohio is on dead tree, wet ink, hard copy paper. Now here's why that matters. We use electronic tabulation to give you that rapid result on election night. That's important. If we didn't have that electronic tabulation, it would probably be Thanksgiving until you knew the results. That wouldn't make anybody happy. But we don't consider that the final word either. We have our bipartisan elections officials count the hard copy ballots by hand. And so we don't have just electronic voting. We don't have just paper voting. We have both in parallel, and the two have to reconcile. We've historically had an accuracy rate above 99%. In fact, 99.98 was the accuracy rate in 2020. 99.99 was the accuracy rate in 2022. And I fully anticipate that we'll have an accuracy rate in that range 3 weeks from now when we conduct our post-election audits, and I hope that many of you choose to cover that. It's an open meeting at the Board of Elections. It's not always all that interesting, so it can be hard to make interesting TV news out of a story that says, breaking news, Board of Elections did not screw up, but it is interesting and it's important for Ohioans to know that when we count the paper, that it matched the election night result that was released using the electronic tabulation. So watch for that as the post-election audits are conducted in the weeks to come. Finally, on public integrity. As you all know, we created a public integrity team in this office. We were one of the first states in the nation to do that. We are fulfilling our statutory responsibility. The law literally says the secretary shall investigate frauds and irregularities. Well, I noticed when I came into this office, if the law says I should investigate, you would think that we would have investigators that can do an investigation, but we didn't. Well, we fixed that. We've hired professional law enforcement people with a law enforcement background, in many cases retired law enforcement professionals that can conduct professional investigations, coming alongside of our county boards of elections. When somebody reports something or when somebody shares something on social media that they believe is a instance of election fraud or voter suppression or any variety of election crimes, we can investigate those. We can put witnesses under oath. We can subpoena documents. We can conduct, in short, a professional law enforcement style investigation that can be turned over to a county prosecutor in such a way that they are much more likely to be able to take that to a grand jury and to get an indictment and to eventually get a prosecution. This is something that really makes Ohio, once again, a leader in the nation, and I'm proud of the work that our team does. To be clear, voter fraud is rare. Voter fraud is exceedingly rare, and it's crucial that we keep it that way, right? Voter fraud is rare because we enforce the law, because a law that's not enforced is not a law, it's a suggestion. And my duty is to make sure that election law is enforced in Ohio, and we will make sure that we do that along with our public integrity team and our great county boards of elections and our state AG and our county prosecutors. If you mess around, you will find out. And if you think that you can get away with election fraud in Ohio, you've got another thing coming. You will face justice for your crime. But we will keep it rare by making sure that the law is enforced, and that's something that's really good news for Ohio. Now, Ohioans can report irregularities by visiting our website, ohiosos.gov/public integrity, ohiosos.gov/public integrity. I would ask you to have your facts together when you go there, because that information that you're submitting is like a police report. It's going to a law enforcement body that's going to conduct a professional investigation. And so if you have something to report that you're concerned about, you can do that at ohiosos.gov/public integrity. And of course, during the course of this administration, we have referred hundreds of cases to county prosecutors and to the state attorney general, because again, we believe that when laws are not enforced, they're not laws, they're suggestions. We're going to make sure they're enforced, and we're going to keep election fraud rare in Ohio. Voter fraud, voter suppression, all of those things are ugly. All of those things are illegal, and we're not going to tolerate any of them. In closing, to reiterate, be kind to your elections officials. Be patient with them. If you have a question, talk to that voting location manager. Thank them for the patriotic work that they're doing. And, Ohio does it right. And that's something we can be proud of. Democrats, Republicans working together to truly be the nation's gold standard in making it easy to vote and hard to cheat. That'll be on full display tomorrow night, and it'd be something that we as Buckeyes can take pride in. And with that, I appreciate you all being here, and I look forward to the questions that you have for me.
Do you have a prediction on turnout for this election? And do you think that the high early vote turnout is an indication of a potential record, or are we just seeing that people are learning how to vote differently?
Yeah. So Jim, I don't make predictions about turnout, because if I'm off by 100,000 people, we'll say, oh, he was predicting low turnout, or didn't know what he was talking about. I will say this: with 2.5 million people already participating in early voting, I think we could be on track to beat the all-time record if there's a big turnout on Election Day. 5.8 was that turnout record in 2020. And that's great news. Listen, I won't rest until we have 100% turnout, which means I won't rest. But we're ready for that high turnout. If there is that record-breaking kind of Election Day turnout, then we will go over the all-time record. And to be clear, the all-time record was set in 2020. And that's something that we can be proud of. I certainly hope that we can surpass that, but it'll be up to the voters tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. Our chief legal counsel is back there. I think you were saying in the recent months we're like 7-0 on lawsuits?
We've had about 5 in the last few months.
Okay. So we get sued a lot. It's unfortunate that that's become a tactic that partisans on both sides of the aisle candidly use. But we've had quite a winning record over the last couple months in those. And again, credit goes to the AG's team, but also because what we're doing is on the right side of the law and consistent with common sense. Yeah.
To get a final certification from the state, you have to get first final certification from all 88 county boards of elections, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
What happens if 1 or 2 or 3 county boards of elections refuses to certify their election? What happens then?
So you're right, it is a very decentralized system. That's by design. I always say I love serving as Ohio's chief elections officer, but I don't personally run elections. It's done by 88 county boards of elections by a bipartisan team of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. If they are somehow unable to certify their results, then they're derelict in their duty, right? There's a reason why every ballot has the signatures of the county board of elections on it. It's the same reason an artist signs her painting, right? Because they take ownership. Their signature's on that ballot because they own the conduct of the election in that county. They are required on a certain timeline to certify that final result, and that's not optional. So they would be in violation of the law if they didn't certify that by a certain date. Now, I suppose there's always a possibility that they end up with a tie vote, and I would break those ties expeditiously, as is my responsibility as the Ohio Secretary of State. I don't anticipate that happening. Listen, I know these folks, and they're partisans. In many cases, the county board of elections is the county Republican chairman and the county Democratic chairman and two trusted folks from their county from each party. And so these are folks that care deeply about their party and their party's candidates. But you know what they place above that? Making sure that they run an honest election and putting the will of the people above that. That's who these elections officials are. They are running this election, and so they will certify those results to us, and I have full confidence that all 88 of them will do so on time, as they're required to do by law.
Is there a follow-up here? Is
Yeah.
there a legal remedy for if they don't? And it's not a tie situation where you can cast the ballot or the vote to certify?
Yeah, so it's kind of a hypothetical, but what happens whenever any public official is not conducting themselves consistent with what the law says? We could secure a judge's order telling them they must do that there would be penalties if they don't. They could be held in contempt. I mean, you can imagine how that could play out. And so again, we don't anticipate that that's going to happen. We expect that just like any public official will conduct their duties consistent with the law, that these elections officials will do the same. If there were some, and there are to be clear, there are not, and I go to dozens of boards of elections every month. I've been all over the state visiting boards. I've heard no inclination whatsoever that anybody would be even thinking about that. But if they would, then again, there are legal remedies to compel public officials to do their job. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, this is the first presidential election with the photo ID requirement for in-person voting. How is that going so far? What are the provisional ballot numbers looking like?
Yeah. So it's going very well because most Ohioans are already used to bringing an ID. Prior to that law change, it was already 98% of Ohioans. And we looked at these numbers. It was over 98% that already brought a state ID or driver's license. I bet almost all of us have one in our pocket right now. And there were, of course, that 2% that were using the alternative forms. But the voter education that we've done, and candidly that all of you have done, has worked. People know they need an ID. In fact, it was a surprise to many Ohioans previously, back in 2020 or 2018, 2016, people were often surprised to find out that it wasn't a requirement, because it is in majority of other states as well. And so there will be some provisional ballots for people that forget an ID or the dog ate it or whatever else, but they will have an opportunity to cure those provisional ballots in the 5 days after the election, from Wednesday through Saturday, and 4 days after the election, between Wednesday and Saturday. And you know, that's something that we don't have provisional numbers so far. That'll be something that we report tomorrow night as part of the election night reporting, though.
Yesterday in Franklin County, at the end of early voting at 5 o'clock, there was still a long line in Franklin County. Other counties, I think, reported some of that as well. Do you think that's not an indication that we need more locations for early voting in the early voting period?
So it was interesting that was the case not just in urban counties, right? We had some of our small rural counties where people were lined up around the courthouse as well. I have always been a supporter of having more early voting locations. Back when I was in the state legislature, I was a supporter of that. But of course, that's a decision that the state legislature needs to make. The law says right now that they have one location per county. Now, they can make that location as large as they care to make it. And that's why counties like Franklin and Cuyahoga and Hamilton have responded, moving their boards of elections in some cases to much larger facilities where they can accommodate more people. County boards of elections knew that this was going to be a high turnout. They also know that the Sunday, the last day of early voting, because I guess procrastination is part of human nature, is always a very high turnout day. Remember, though, that prior to yesterday, there were 4 weeks of early voting, many of those days, Tuesday afternoons, Saturday mornings, where there weren't lines, right? And of course, people also have the option of voting from the comfort of their own kitchen table, which is what Lauren and I did, where there's, of course, no line. And so people make their choices, whether you choose early in person, whether you choose absentee, or whether you choose election day. You know, if you time out your visit to your polling location tomorrow, you are more or less likely to impact lines, right, or to encounter lines. So if you go right at 6:30, maybe a line. If you go right after work at 5:45, probably will be a line. But if you go during the middle of the day, if your work schedule, your family schedule allows that, then you're much less likely to see that. But again, if the state legislature would choose to add more early voting locations, I would be a supporter of that, as I have been for over a decade.
Voter fraud is rare, but there are some cases
Mm-hmm.
that slip through the cracks. Should Ohioans be worried that if there are a handful of cases that slip through the cracks or whatever, that it's going to impact the outcome of the election?
Yeah. Elections in Ohio, and really nationwide, come down to small margins these days, right? I mean, I can think of 2 mayors in this state that are in that office because of a coin flip, right? People know that if there's a tie, like a dead tie, the exact same number of votes for both candidates, the boards of elections flip a coin. That happens dozens of times every year. In fact, we usually put out a press release in December that lists how many elections were determined by a single vote, and it's usually more than 2 dozen. And so those are generally local offices, city council, school board, mayors, but those are important offices, right? And so election fraud is rare, but even 1 or 2 or 10 or a dozen instances could impact a very local election. Now listen, is it likely to impact a statewide election? Statistically speaking, probably not. But it does, it could impact a local election, and that's why we take it so seriously. And that's why again, people should know, and there's a deterrent factor to this as well. If you think you can get away with voter fraud in Ohio, you can't. We'll make sure that you are prosecuted and that you face justice for your crime, and we'll keep it rare. I mean, we're talking about a fraction of a percent, and so it's important for people to know that it is rare and we'll keep it rare. But here's the other thing. When it does occur, the impact can be real. It's like carjackings. Those are rare in my neighborhood, thank God. But if one occurs, I want the bad guy to be put in jail, right? And so that we keep it rare. And that's because the consequences of that kind of crime are severe. I mean, this is how we choose our leaders. This is how we set the direction, the policy for our state, our communities, and our nation. And so we're just not going to tolerate any level of voter fraud. There's not like an acceptable level where we say, okay, if it's only certain percent, we're just going to look the other way. 0% is the tolerable level of voter fraud.
I have a question. Some of the sheriffs have said things that indicate to voters that they might not protect their rights, their voting rights, when they go into voting booth. We've heard from the Clark County Sheriff saying something about Dems voting, and he wouldn't protect them. And we've heard what Portage County Sheriff has said about writing down addresses of certain people. Is there any reason that any voter in Ohio should be afraid of going to the polls? And what are you going to do if there are reports of voters who are being harassed, intimidated, otherwise denied their opportunity to vote, and the sheriff in that locality doesn't seem to be getting the job done?
Yeah, well, and to be clear, we've got layers of law enforcement. We've got our city and township and village police. We've got our county sheriffs, and then, of course, we've got our state law enforcement. The men and women of law enforcement take their work seriously. Candidates that are running for the office of sheriff may say things on the campaign trail that perhaps are ill-advised or what have you, but that doesn't in any way implicate the dedicated, sworn deputies that work for them. Those are dedicated people that are first and foremost lawmen and women. They've sworn an oath to do this. They put their life on the line to do this, and I have every confidence that they take that duty very seriously. And let's talk about what that duty is. It says it very clear in the Ohio Revised Code, and we share it with our law enforcement partners in a memo. We call it the law enforcement letter that goes out usually a month before the election. They have a responsibility to maintain peace and order at our polling locations. They'll do that. I have every confidence that they'll do that. They have an obligation to investigate instances of voter fraud or voter suppression and work with our county boards of elections to make sure that those kind of things don't happen. What they're not there to do is to, be the arbiters of every argument somebody has in a line about what they're wearing and that kind of thing. They're going to be focused on public safety, and that's their responsibility, and I have every confidence that they'll do that. God forbid that didn't happen, then we would work with other local law enforcement entities and, if necessary, with the state patrol and the state partners to make sure that the law was properly enforced in that polling location or in that board of elections. I don't anticipate that that's going to happen.
Does your office provide instruction to poll watchers, those that are in a position to be able to challenge the eligibility of a voter at the polls?
Instructions to the sense that there are certain things allowed under law and not. Remember that poll watchers are different from poll workers. It's right there in the title. The poll workers are working, the poll watchers are watching, observing on behalf of parties and candidates that nominate them. They are credentialed for that job. They have to take an oath. They have to be Ohio electors and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a lot of standards, and they're well aware of those standards. And if they violate those standards, then they'll be bounced. I mean, they won't be able to get in people's way, for example, or cause disruptions at our county board, our voting locations. I have every confidence that they're going to be ready for that. And I've gotten on conference calls with groups of them to give them some admonitions like, hey, remember, most problems are the result of an honest mistake. So talk to your voting location manager to rectify that, and that'll solve 90% of problems at a polling location. And of course, if a poll watcher or an election observer sees something that rises above that, they can step outside and make a phone call to their hotline, whichever party or candidate they're working for, and then the legal team from those entities will get involved. They're part of the process, and I have confidence that, as they always have, that they'll follow the rules and conduct themselves in a proper way.
As you said, voter fraud is
Go ahead, Morgan.
rare.
Yeah.
So what is your next move if a candidate baselessly claims that the election was stolen?
Yeah. So it is certainly within any candidate's right to challenge the work that public officials do. That's an age-old thing. They've got remedies to do that, including legal remedies that they can avail themselves of. Given that if imagine that scenario played out in Ohio, I would be the defendant in those kind of lawsuits, so I probably wouldn't have a lot to say publicly in the moment. But what I've been clear about is this. My job is to run elections so well that the loser knows they lost. I mean, intuitively, the winner always knows they won. They're going to go out and they're going to give a victory speech. We need to do our job so well, so transparently, so above reproach, that sometime around 10:30 on election night, the person that comes up short at any level, from the most local office all the way to the top, looks at those results and says, yep, I need to try harder next time. I came up short this time. I'm going to call the winner and congratulate them. We've met that standard in Ohio. We met it in 2020. We met it in 2022. I mean, we've met that standard in Ohio repeatedly, that we run it so well that the loser knows they lost. And I have every confidence that we'll do that again tomorrow. Yeah. Deva.
Yeah, okay. So, follow up on what she said earlier on voters suppression and intimidation. Has any report come to you officially of any voter intimidation, and where did it come from?
Yeah, so in this election, I'm happy to say that we've not had any that have risen to the level of requiring any kind of law enforcement action. David, you remember in 2020, because of the work that we had done engaging with Ohio's diverse minority communities, that we were made aware of a racist robocall that was going out in the Cleveland area. Because I'd built relationships with these community leaders, I was getting text messages within minutes of that robocall going out where people had recorded it. We were able to elevate that to state and federal law enforcement, who launched an investigation, who indicted and brought to justice the two criminals that did that. That's a great success story, and that's exactly how that would play out if something like that did happen again. When I say we won't tolerate fraud and we won't tolerate suppression, we mean that. Neither of those things are common, and neither of those things are ever tolerable, but I'm happy to say that we have not had, but we're always on the lookout for, credible reports of, sort of active voter suppression occurring here in Ohio in this election.
Your office sent out a release recently about the voter attire law in a polling location, and it ultimately said if somebody refuses to take off their Trump hat or their Harris shirt and they're otherwise eligible to vote, they're not going to be removed. So, what is the point of that law? Ultimately?
Yeah. Well, that's a question for our state General Assembly, but my job is to make sure that we enforce all the laws, and sometimes they can come into conflict with one another, right? That's why we have executive office holders that have to figure out how to navigate that. This can become a distraction, to be candid. We've got millions of people that deserve an opportunity to vote tomorrow in a polling location that is orderly and peaceful. What we're not going to get into is, feeding into somebody's effort to film a viral social media video where they're looking for a conflict, right? Somebody walking in with their buddy recording it, thinking, all right, now I'm going to get these poll workers to talk harshly to me, and we're going to make this go viral. Like, I'm not interested in that circus, and so we're just not going to play that game. But what the law says is that we have to maintain order at the polling locations. What the law says is that we're not suppressing anyone's vote. We're not disenfranchising anyone from voting, regardless of what they're wearing. And the law also says that you can't campaign inside a polling location, right? So yeah, sometimes these things can come into conflict. So what we wanted to do is provide to our elections officials, as they were asking, some more clear guidance, because this has been interpreted very strictly by some counties, and it's been interpreted more liberally by other counties. I'll give you an example. There have been cases where somebody comes in wearing their T-shirt of their high school football mascot. Maybe it's because their kid plays ball at that school. But somebody would look at that and say, well, that's an expression of support for the school levy. You have to take it off. Well, now that's getting ridiculous, right? We're seeing examples right now where certain items have become emblematic for certain candidates, right? I was out in my personal capacity over the weekend on the campaign trail with Mr. Moreno, and people were showing up wearing reflective vests and garbage bags with holes cut in them because of the silly comments, the unfortunate comments that President Biden had made. So, like, where do we draw the line on this? Well, we wanted to give our boards of elections some very clear guidance. If we are required by law to maintain that idea that there's no campaigning in a polling location, we would draw that line at the candidate's name, statements like vote for, vote against a levy, or vote for, or vote against an issue. Again, the candidate's logo, things that are directly advocating for that candidate. But what we're not interested in doing is, again, creating a scene. We're not interested in doing is holding up everybody else that's trying to get their civic duty done at the polling location. And so if somebody insists on wearing that clothing, we're going to write their name down, turn it over to the County Board of Elections, which could choose to pursue prosecution because it is a crime. But we're not going to keep that person from voting, certainly. They're going to cast their ballot, they're going to get their I voted sticker, and they're going to be on their way. We've also trained our poll workers in de-escalation. You can talk to anybody in law enforcement. Any career public safety professional would tell you you can turn the heat up or you can turn the heat down in the first few seconds of an interaction. And so we've trained our poll workers. We've got videos about this. We've trained our poll workers to bring the temperature down, to be open and civil and kind with people and say, I understand everybody's excited about Election Day and we all have candidates that we support and feel strongly about, but in here, you're not allowed to campaign. And it's my job to enforce the law. So, hey, don't blame me. It's my job as the poll worker to enforce the law. And so we're going to ask you to step into the bathroom and turn that inside out, or to put a jacket on, or to take the hat off. We're going to ask you to do that because it's the law. If you choose not to do that, we're just going to take your name down and report that violation to the County Board of Elections, but nobody is going to prevent you from voting. And that in that way, again, trying to de-escalate this, trying to turn the temperature down, and not get into some silly thing where we're just feeding into somebody's effort to create a viral video on social media.
Do you get many reports of people doing things that leads to them being forcibly ejected from a polling site? Not for attire, but just in terms of the kind of conduct that could actually get...
Yeah, listen, let's not get too much into hypotheticals, but I'll say this. The only thing in my mind that would rise to that would be something that creates a safety hazard. Somebody that is acting in a violent or threatening way. Of course, that would be dealt with by law enforcement because we have to maintain the peace and protect people. But again, we're looking to get every registered voter an opportunity to vote and get them on their way. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Compared to other elections, this election we've seen an increased use of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
On the campaign cycles nationwide. We saw the robocall that was a voice that was supposed to be President Biden.
Mm-hmm.
It was not his. Can you detail efforts that your office, the state, has done to identify those as clearly generated by AI, and should there be something that maybe lawmakers should take up to regulate or clearly identify that these are made through.
Yeah. So to be clear, what we're talking about here is deceptive information, right? Unfortunately, that's nothing new in American politics. It's only gotten more sophisticated, right? As you know, Ohio's had past legal challenges about false statements, for example, and that kind of thing. Where we've landed as a society, and where I've landed, is that you don't want some government entity to be the arbiter of what's truth and what's not truth. That's not consistent with the way that we operate as a society. But what we have insisted on is disclaimers and information. What I would like to see is something that requires a clear disclaimer. If you are using that kind of technology to create a fake video. And I think it's important for all of us as consumers of information and for all of you all as leaders in the media to help encourage people to be skeptical consumers of information. We've never had so much access to information, but at the same time been so misinformed. I mean, we literally have the world's knowledge at our fingertips, and it's information overload. And the question is, what's truthful, what's dubious, what's trustworthy, and you've got to be a skeptical consumer of information. And I think that disclaimers would be important. That would be something that the state legislature would have to pass, or at the federal level. I think that as a best practice, some groups have voluntarily done that. It's not unlike satire, right? When people use satire to make a point politically, they'll often, say, "Hey, this is fake. This is a satirical account on social media," for example, and that kind of thing. Same way with the use of so-called deep fakes or faking a candidate's name or image, voice, that kind of thing. Now, here's a very real elections administration impact that we've thought through with our teams, is that imagine somebody faking my voice in a call to a county board of elections saying, do this or do that. And so we've put in place authentication protocols with our county boards of elections to make sure that kind of thing couldn't happen here in Ohio. And that's something that is, again, we've seen that in private enterprise as well, because it is so easy to fake a voice or a likeness. You got to have authentication to make sure that instructions that are being given are truthfully coming from the person that is authorized to give those instructions.
One last
Yeah.
question from me. I'll shut up after this, but.
Never.
Tomorrow is supposed to be warm, okay?
Uh-huh.
It's going to be a lot of people voting. There could potentially be lines at some polling places.
Mm-hmm.
If someone, a group or a human that is out there, knowingly working in some capacity, offers a bottle of water to some old lady who's standing in line who's ready to collapse, is that a law that they cannot give them a bottle of water, or is that just considered
Of course
a
not.
normal act of kindness?
Yeah,
And
no.
where does that line go?
Of course not. And common sense, right? That's being a decent human. What the law says is that you can't offer something of value to entice a vote. And I think we all know why that's important. So if you walked up to the kind old woman who's waiting in line and said, "I'll give you this bottle of water if you can promise me that you're voting for candidate X," okay, come on. Common sense. We've dealt with this in early voting locations where people have food trucks or whatever else. Is that being used as an enticement to vote? Are you requiring people to swear that they supported a certain candidate or even that they voted? Then that's against the law. Common sense here. I mean, it's not uncommon. And again, I'm not going to be the guy to say this can't happen. At polling locations, at the church, at the school, for the local group to do a baked goods thing where they're bringing food in for the poll workers, that's human kindness and decency, right? And so, again, common sense. Is it being used to entice a vote? Then it's illegal. Other questions?
Summit County Board of Elections deadlocked on residency for
Yeah.
Representative Amelia Sykes. What's the status on that?
The status on that is that they are presenting their arguments for and against, and it's following the normal course of breaking tie votes in this office, and it certainly won't be resolved before this election. I'm not going to get into too much depth on this because, of course, I have this responsibility of breaking these tie votes, and generally most of the time these things are pretty black and white. I mean, the law says X or the law says Y, and then we'll step in and not make a partisan decision, but make a legal decision about what the law says. I will say, though, and this is the only thing I'm going to say about this, is that residency cases can be very difficult. There's been a history of litigation on this. There's a legal standard about intent to return. I mean, this is used by me when I was in the military. I didn't care much about politics at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, or Fort Bragg, North Carolina, so I continued to be an Ohio voter, and so because I intended to return here. And so again, that's the legal standard, and so we're going to review the law, we're going to review the case, and we're going to make the right legal decision regardless of what the partisan politics of that are. Any other questions? All right, I'll end with this. Ohio's good at this, and it's something that we do together. It's something we should be proud of. It is rare in all of human history that we get to choose who our leaders are, if you think about it. For thousands of years on this planet, the way to choose who was in charge was either force or heredity. And we've got a much better way of doing it. We have a duty to make sure that that process is run smoothly, cleanly, transparently, and to make sure that when Ohioans go to bed on election night, they know whether their favorite candidates won or lost, that it was an honest process. That's my duty. That's the duty of 35,000 elections officials, and tomorrow we're going to carry that out. That's worth celebrating, and I look forward to doing that work on behalf of every Ohioan tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. God bless.